But at the last second, she snatched the scarlet, off-the-shoulder dress, the one Brian called her killer dress. Tonight, she was going to war, and she intended to win. "Are you seriously going to wear that?" Brian stood in the bedroom doorway, fastening his watch. His voice held a mixture of admiration and anxiety. "What, you don't like it?" Jessica turned, raising an eyebrow. "I like it. It's Christina's birthday. A casual get-together with friends." "Friends," Jessica mimicked, pulling the dress on. "Brian, we both know your childhood friend wants more than friendship. She's sunk her claws into you." "Jess, don't start," her husband said wearily. "We've just known each other a long time." "A long time," Jessica spun around, her gray eyes flashing. "You hadn't seen each other for 20 years. 20. Then 6 months ago she shows up, and now it's Christina this and Christina that. Bri, let's get coffee. Bri, help me pick out a new phone. Bri, my faucet is leaking, and you're so good with plumbing. I'm just helping someone who's going through a divorce." "The divorce was 2 years ago." Jessica's voice rose. 2 years, Brian. She's long since recovered and is now systematically snaring my husband in her sticky web. Brian sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose, his usual gesture when he wanted to avoid an argument. "Jess, I love you. You're my wife, the mother of my children. What does Christina have to do with any of this?" "It has everything to do with it. When she's around, you look at her like she's the last glass of water in the desert." A heavy silence fell between them. Brian opened his mouth, then closed it without saying a word. That silence told Jessica more than any excuse could have. She turned back to the mirror and started on her makeup, her hands trembling slightly with anger, hurt, and fear. 14 years of marriage, 2 kids, a mortgage, a joint business, shared friends. Their lives were completely intertwined. And then came this, Christina, with her big blue eyes, her feigned helplessness, her "I'm so lonely after the divorce" act. Jessica remembered their first meeting 3 months ago perfectly. Brian had invited Christina over for dinner. "You two will love each other," he'd said. Jessica had been expecting a frumpy housewife or a stressed-out career woman. Instead, the doorbell rang, and there stood a tall blonde with a model's figure, dressed in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater. "Jessica!" Christina had beamed, rushing to hug her like an old friend. "I'm so happy to finally meet you. Bree has told me so much about you." Bri. From the very first minute, she called him Bree, a nickname Jessica had never heard anyone use in all their years of marriage. Even his own mother called him Brian. Throughout that dinner, Christina had gazed at Brian with dewy eyes, reminiscing about their childhood. "Remember how we used to climb into that abandoned house? And how you protected me from those bullies in 7th grade? And remember when we—" And Brian remembered, smiling that special, soft, warm smile. Jessica sat beside them like an extra in someone else's play. After that dinner, Christina became a constant presence in their lives. She would appear everywhere, bumping into Brian at the grocery store, showing up at the same cafe where he and Jessica liked to have breakfast on weekends. She called at the most inconvenient times, and Brian either didn't notice or pretended not to. "Mommy, why are you so pretty?" 7-year-old Katie peeked into the bedroom, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Sweetheart, you should be asleep." Jessica knelt beside her daughter. "Grandma Helen is here. She'll be with you." "Are you going to Aunt Christina's house?" Jessica winced. Aunt Christina. Another one of the woman's conquests, her children. Christina brought them gifts, remembered their birthdays, asked about their school activities. A perfect strategy. "Yes, sweetie, it's her birthday." "Why does she always come alone? Doesn't she have any kids of her own?" Brian's voice came from the hallway. "Katie Bug, go to Grandma. Your ice cream is going to melt." The little girl squealed with delight and ran off. Jessica slowly stood up, smoothing her dress. In the mirror, a beautiful woman with tired eyes stared back at her. "Jess." Brian came up behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Let's not ruin the evening. Christina is just an old friend. Nothing more." "Do you even believe that yourself?" Jessica asked, looking at his reflection. "I believe in us." He turned her to face him. "In you and me. In our family." Jessica wanted to believe his words, to feel secure in his touch, but something inside her was twisted into a tight knot. She had seen the way he looked at Christina. It wasn't a lustful or hungry look, but something nostalgic, dreamy, as if Christina were a doorway to his past, a time when he was young, free, and full of hope. "It's time to go," Jessica said, pulling away from his embrace. In the living room, her mother-in-law, Helen, met them. A thin, stern woman with cold blue eyes, she looked Jessica up and down. "A red dress," she stated. "A bold choice." "It's a special evening," Jessica replied with a tight smile. "This Christina's birthday." Helen pressed her lips together. "Brian, I don't understand why you need this woman in your life. You have a family." "Mom, please." Brian grabbed the car keys. "It's just a friendship." "Friendship?" Helen snorted. "I've lived 65 years. I know what friendship looks like, and I know what a huntress looks like, too." Jessica felt an unexpected surge of gratitude for her mother-in-law. They didn't usually get along, but right now, at least someone was on her side. In the car, Brian turned on the radio, filling the silence with music. Jessica stared out the window at the passing streets. It was a warm May evening, promising summer. Couples walked hand in hand, laughing, embracing. Jessica remembered when she and Brian had been just like that in love, happy, certain of their future. "What are you thinking about?" Brian asked. "About when everything changed," Jessica answered honestly. He didn't ask what she meant. He understood. The restaurant was downtown, on the rooftop of a historic building. Panoramic windows offered a view of the evening city as the lights began to twinkle on, one by one. Brian offered Jessica his hand as she got out of the car, and she noticed him adjust his tie, glancing at his reflection in the car window. He was nervous. He was nervous about seeing Christina. The elevator carried them to the top floor, and with every passing second, Jessica felt the tension mount. She clutched her small, elegant, nearly useless handbag. Inside were her phone, her lipstick, and her resolve not to let this woman destroy her marriage. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into the restaurant. The room was about a third full, with around 30 guests. Soft music played under the low lights. And there, in the center, shining like a star, stood Christina. She was wearing a white dress, of course, white, the symbol of innocence and purity. Her hair was gathered in a messy bun from which blonde tendrils escaped. Minimal makeup created an effect of natural beauty. When she saw Brian, her face lit up with such joy that Jessica felt a wave of nausea. "Bree!" Christina rushed toward them, Jessica noted, but she only hugged Brian. "For a long time. Too long. I'm so glad you could make it." "Happy birthday, Christina." Brian handed her a bouquet of peonies. "Oh my God, you remembered these are my favorite flowers?" She clutched the bouquet to her chest, her blue eyes filling with tears. "Thank you. You were always so thoughtful." Her favorite flowers, Jessica noted to herself. She hadn't known that. Brian hadn't mentioned it, but he had bought them specifically. Jessica. Christina finally deigned to look at her. "What a dress. You look vibrant." In that one word, vibrant, Jessica heard it all. Vulgar, inappropriate, trying too hard to get attention. Jessica forced a smile. "Thanks. I decided not to blend in with the decor." They were led to their tables. Christina seated Brian next to herself. Jessica ended up one person over, next to some co-worker of the birthday girl. All evening, Jessica watched them. She watched how Christina leaned toward Brian, whispering something in his ear, how she laughed at his jokes, touched his arm, brushed a non-existent piece of lint from his jacket, and Brian? Brian didn't stop her. He smiled, responded, and dove into their shared memories. And with every passing minute, Jessica felt a cold fury building inside her. Waiters served appetizers, glasses were filled with champagne, and the party gradually got underway. Jessica mechanically smiled at her table mate, a heavy-set woman in her 50s who was breathlessly complaining about her boss, but the words floated past her, not registering. Her entire focus was locked on the two figures at the other end of the table, on her husband and on the woman who was now leaning so close to him that her hair almost brushed his cheek. Christina laughed, a clear, genuine sound, throwing her head back to expose a long, white neck. and Brian watched her with an expression Jessica hadn't seen on his face in years. It was the look of a man who had forgotten he was in his 40s, forgotten about the mortgage, the parent-teacher conferences, the utility bills, the fact that he had to take Max to the orthodontist in the morning. He was looking at her the way a 20-year-old looks, openly, hungrily, as if trying to absorb every second. And so I tell her, this is the 7th report this month. What do we need so many for? Her neighbor continued her monologue, oblivious to the fact that Jessica wasn't listening. Excuse me. Jessica stood up abruptly, feeling the dress cling to her body, the heels giving her an extra few inches of height. I need to use the restroom. She walked slowly through the room, her back straight, and caught Brian's eyes following her out of the corner of her vision. Good. Let him watch. Let him remember he had a wife who could still make men turn their heads. In the restroom, Jessica leaned her hands on the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes gleaming with either anger or unshed tears. She couldn't tell which. She turned on the cold water and carefully wet her wrists, trying not to smudge her makeup. She had to get a grip. No scenes, no showing weakness. Especially not here, surrounded by strangers, in front of this Christina who was just waiting for her to crack. The door opened behind her, and the birthday girl's reflection appeared in the mirror. Of course. It was as if she had sensed it. Jessica. Christina walked over, tucking a stray strand of hair back into her bun. Is everything okay? You left so suddenly. Everything's perfect. Jessica turned, forcing a smile. It's just a little stuffy in there. Yes, a lot of people showed up. Christina pulled a lipstick from her tiny purse and began touching up her lips. I'm so glad Bree could come. He's been, well, you know, such a rock for me lately. Jessica felt something inside her clench. A rock? She repeated, trying to keep her tone even. Yes. Christina turned, a look of feigned innocence swimming in her blue eyes. It was so hard after the divorce, I even thought, well, never mind. And then I found Bree again, and he's just so attentive, so caring. He helped me move, helped with repairs. He even went with me to pick out furniture. Can you imagine? We spent 3 hours in a showroom, choosing a sofa. 3 hours. Brian had said he was stuck late at work. Jessica remembered that day. It was early March. She had made dinner, expecting him home by 7, but he hadn't returned until 10, tired and distracted. He had mumbled something about an urgent project and gone straight to the shower. I didn't realize my husband was such a furniture expert, Jessica said, hearing her own voice become harder, sharper. Oh, he's an expert at everything. Christina turned back to the mirror, adjusting her dress. And you know, I think he likes helping, feeling needed, important. I guess that gets lost over time in a marriage, right? All the mundane little things, the kids, the work, you stop noticing each other. Jessica took a step forward, and Christina instinctively stepped back. Listen to me very carefully. Jessica spoke quietly, but each word landed like a blow. I see exactly what you're doing. All these accidental meetings, the phone calls, the requests for help, your helplessness, your fragility, your big sad eyes. You are hunting my husband. Christina feigned surprise, but a smile trembled at the corners of her mouth. Jess, are you serious? We're just childhood friends, nothing more. Childhood friends who haven't seen each other in 20 years? Jessica shot back. If you were looking for friendship, you'd be friends with his wife too. You'd invite us both, show interest in our family. But you only want Brian. Alone, without me. Christina was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, all traces of feigned softness were gone from her voice. And maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is that Brian is bored, that he misses the fun and spontaneity he had when he was young. You've turned him into a workhorse home, kids, bills, responsibilities. I just remind him of a time when he was free and happy. He is happy. Jessica's voice wavered. He has a family, children he loves. Loves, yes, Christina agreed, but that doesn't make him happy. It makes him responsible. Those are two different things, Jessica. They stood facing each other, two women fighting for one man. And in that small restroom, among the gleaming mirrors and marble sinks, the fate of a marriage was being decided. Brian won't leave me. Jessica said, though she wasn't sure of her own words. We have 2 kids, 14 years together. Do you know what keeps people in marriages? Christina tilted her head, studying Jessica with the detached curiosity of an entomologist examining a butterfly. Habit, fear of change, not wanting to hurt the children, but not love. Love is what you had at the beginning. Then it dissolves into domesticity, into arguments over who forgot to turn off the light or who didn't buy milk. And what are you offering? Jessica crossed her arms over her chest. A new love? A fresh passion? Do you think it'll be any different with you in a year? I don't know, Christina admitted honestly, but at least we'll have that year. What do you 2 have? Memories of how good things used to be. The restroom door swung open, letting in a wave of voices and music. A girl in her 20s, cheerful and a little drunk, walked in and began humming to herself as she checked her reflection. Christina gave Jessica a soft smile, as if they had been discussing the weather and not the future of someone else's marriage. We should go. The guests are waiting, she said, and headed for the door. Jessica remained standing, feeling her heart pound. Her hands were shaking, and she clenched them into fists, trying to regain control. She couldn't show how much Christina's words had affected her. She couldn't give her that victory. When Jessica returned to the main room, Brian was in the same spot, now talking to a middle-aged man, likely one of Christina's colleagues. Seeing his wife, he stood and walked over. Is everything okay? You were gone for a while. I'm fine. Jessica picked up a glass of champagne from the table and took a long sip. The wine was cold, the bubbles tickling her tongue. Jess, Brian lowered his voice, you're angry. I can see it. Really? She looked at him. And what exactly do you see, Brian? I see that you've been tense all evening. I see that you're uncomfortable here. I'm uncomfortable watching my rival flirt with my husband, Jessica blurted out, her voice low but clear. I'm uncomfortable watching the way you look at her. I look at her like an old friend, Brian began, but Jessica cut him off. No. You look at her the way you used to look at me. Like a possibility, like something that could change your life. Brian opened his mouth to object, but the words caught in his throat, because it was the truth, and they both knew it. Everyone, please take your seats. Christina's voice cut through the tension between them. They're bringing out the cake. The guests murmured excitedly, laughing as they moved back to their places. Jessica and Brian were left standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by other people's joy. And for the first time in their 14 years of marriage, a chasm had opened between them, and it was terrifying to think of building a bridge across it. Let's go, Jessica said, and was the first to walk back to the table. The cake was 3 tiers high, decorated with buttercream roses. As the waiters brought it in to a round of applause, Christina lit the candles. 38 candles, 1 for each year of her life. Make a wish, someone shouted from the crowd. Christina closed her eyes, and just before she did, Jessica saw her gaze flicker toward Brian. She saw her smile, that special, intimate smile, meant for only one person, and Jessica knew that a disaster was imminent. The candles were blown out to cheerful applause, the cake was cut into perfect triangular slices, and the waiters distributed the dessert. Jessica stared at her portion, a delicate sponge cake with strawberry cream, topped with a sugar rose, and felt her stomach clench with nausea. She couldn't eat. She couldn't pretend everything was fine, while that woman sat next to her husband, making plans for his future. Friends? Christina stood up, holding a glass of champagne, and the room gradually fell silent. Thank you all for coming to share this evening with me. You are all so important to me. She surveyed the guests, her gaze lingering on Brian just a fraction longer than on anyone else. This year has been a difficult one, Christina continued, a dramatic note entering her voice. I've reevaluated a lot of things, understood a lot about myself, about what I want, about who is truly dear to me. Jessica gripped the edge of the tablecloth under the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She squeezed, feeling the fabric bunch in her palm. Sometimes, Christina's voice grew softer, more intimate, as if she were speaking not to the room but to one specific person. Life brings people back to us, people we lost many years ago. And it's not a coincidence, it's a sign. Brian sat motionless, looking at Christina, and Jessica couldn't read the expression on his face. It was something between embarrassment and fascination, a dangerous mix that promised nothing good. "So, let's drink to not being afraid to follow our desires," Christina raised her glass. "To being honest with ourselves, and to those who make our lives brighter." The guests raised their glasses, cheered, and laughed. Someone joked about the absence of a boyfriend. Someone else demanded the birthday girl kiss the most handsome man in the room. Jessica saw several glances turn toward Brian, saw the smiles widen, saw the anticipation hanging in the air. "Come on, Christina, don't be shy," shouted the same heavy-set woman who had been sitting next to Jessica. "Pick one," Christina laughed, covering her mouth with her hand in a gesture meant to look demure. But Jessica saw the calculation in those blue eyes. She watched as Christina slowly circled the table, heading straight for their spot, as all the guests held their breath. Jessica stood up sharply, so sharply that the chair behind her rocked. All eyes turned to her. Christina smiled coyly. "Maybe you'll loan me your husband? Just for a moment. It'll be like a fairy tale. I'll kiss him, and he'll break the spell and realize who the most important woman in his life is." "I'm sorry, Christina," Jessica said, her voice loud and clear for the whole room to hear. "But the most handsome man here is my husband, and I'm the only one who will be kissing him." A tense silence fell over the room. Christina stopped in her tracks, her smile frozen on her face. Brian looked at Jessica with such surprise, it was as if he were seeing her for the first time. And then, something flickered in his eyes. Respect? Interest? Jessica couldn't be sure. "Of course," Christina said after a pause. "I wasn't really going to. It was just a game." "A game," Jessica repeated, and the word was a challenge. "Yes, I suppose this is all just a game to you." The atmosphere in the room grew awkward. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone cleared their throat. Christina returned to her seat, but the expression on her face had changed. The mask of a sweet, vulnerable woman was beginning to crack, revealing something else beneath it, something cold and calculating. Jessica sat back down, feeling the adrenaline course through her veins. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. She had made a scene at someone else's party, shown everyone her irritation, her jealousy. But to stay silent any longer would have been impossible. A little more, and she would have exploded. "Jessica," Brian leaned toward her, speaking quietly, "why did you do that?" "Why?" She turned to him, her eyes blazing with anger. "Are you seriously asking me that? Did you see what she's been doing all night?" "She's just having fun at her own birthday party," Brian said, still quiet, trying not to draw attention. "And you made a scene." "I made a scene?" Jessica felt something inside her break. "Brian," she said, in no uncertain terms, "that she wants to get back what she lost many years ago. She was talking about you. In front of me, in front of all these people." "You're exaggerating." But there was no confidence in his voice. "No," Jessica shook her head. "For the first time, I'm seeing the situation for what it is. You're the one who keeps closing your eyes to it." Waiters brought the main courses: warm steak salad, baked cod, seafood pasta. The guests livened up, and conversations resumed, though now glances kept darting toward Jessica and Brian, and then to Christina, who was pointedly chatting and laughing with her colleagues as if nothing had happened. Jessica picked up her fork and tried a piece of fish, but the food wouldn't go down. She put her silverware down and took a sip of water. Beside her, Brian wasn't eating either. He sat staring at his plate, and it was clear his thoughts were far away. "You're mad at me," Jessica stated. "I'm not mad." He looked up. "I just don't understand why you're behaving this way. Christina is an old friend. We haven't seen each other in years. Don't I have the right to talk to people from my past?" "You do," Jessica agreed. "But she doesn't want to be your friend, Brian. She wants more, and if you can't see that, you're either blind or you're pretending to be." Brian fell silent, and Jessica saw something shift in his face. His jaw tensed, and his gaze hardened. "Maybe this isn't about Christina," he said slowly. "Maybe it's about us. About the fact that something has been wrong between us for a long time." Those words hit harder than Jessica had expected, because they contained a grain of truth she didn't want to admit. Yes, a weariness had settled between them long ago. Yes, They had become functions, parents, household partners, but not lovers. When was the last time they had just laughed together? When was the last time they had made love not out of habit, but out of desire? "And you think Christina is going to fix that?" Jessica asked quietly. "I never said I wanted her to fix anything," Brian retorted. "But with her, it's easy, you understand? We talk, we laugh, and I don't feel the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. She doesn't nag me for being late from work. She doesn't ask why I forgot to buy milk. With her, I can just be myself." "And you can't be yourself with me?" Jessica's voice trembled. Brian didn't answer, and his silence was more eloquent than any words. The evening dragged on like a festering wound, each minute an eternity. Jessica sat at the table, smiling when she had to, nodding in response to her neighbor's comments, but all her attention was on her husband. Brian was drinking more than usual, his third glass of wine, when he rarely had more than two. His cheeks were slightly flushed, his movements a bit sharper, and Jessica knew he was on edge too. The music grew louder, the guests relaxed, and a few couples got up to dance. Christina flitted between tables, accepting congratulations, laughing, hugging her friends, but her gaze kept returning to Brian, like a compass needle to north. Christina approached their table, holding a bottle of wine. "You're barely drinking. Let me pour you some more." She leaned over him, and the neckline of her white dress was right at his eye level. Jessica saw Brian flinch and look away, but the blush creeping up his neck betrayed his embarrassment. "I'm driving," he mumbled. "Oh, come on," Christina smiled, pouring him wine anyway. "One more glass won't hurt, or you can just stay the night. I have a big apartment, plenty of room." "Thank you, but we have children," Jessica interjected coldly. "We need to get home." "Children." Christina straightened up, and a hint of mockery entered her voice. "Of course the children. Your parents, after all. Always parents, first and foremost." She said it as if parents were a synonym for boring or trapped. Jessica felt anger boil up inside her but held it back. Not here, not now. She wouldn't give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. "Yes," Jessica said firmly, "we are parents, and we're proud of it." Christina was about to reply, but a group of guests came over, demanding a photo with her. With a final glance at Brian, she moved toward the impromptu photo op by the window. "Jessica." Brian turned to his wife. "Listen, maybe we really should talk. Not here, at home. About us. About what's happening. About how you're falling in love with another woman?" Jessica asked point blank. Brian froze, his glass halfway to his lips. "I'm not falling in love," he said, but his words lacked conviction. "It's just, Christina reminds me of a time when everything was simpler, when my whole life was ahead of me, full of possibilities. And now?" Jessica leaned closer, her voice hardening. "Now, all that's ahead are obligations? A boring marriage? Kids who keep you from being free? You're twisting my words." "No," Jessica shook her head. "I'm hearing what you're really saying. You're tired of our life, tired of me, and you're looking for a way out." Brian set his glass down and ran a hand over his face. The gesture was filled with such exhaustion that Jessica suddenly felt a real fear. It wasn't his anger she was afraid of, not a fight, but this quiet desperation, which meant he had already made up his mind. "I'm not looking for a way out," Brian said finally. "I just feel like I'm suffocating. Work, home, work, home. It's the same thing, day after day. And the only bright spots are when I see Christina. When we talk about books, about music, about things we liked when we were young. I remember who I used to be, who I wanted to become." "And who did you want to become?" Jessica asked, feeling a chill spread through her. "Not a husband? Not a father?" "That's not what I mean." Brian rubbed his temples. "God, Jess, why do you have to turn everything into a drama?" "Because it is a drama." Jessica's voice cracked, and a few heads turned in their direction. She lowered her voice, leaning toward her husband. "You're sitting here, drinking wine, looking at another woman the way you haven't looked at me in years, and telling me you're suffocating in our marriage. What is that, if not a drama?" Brian was silent, staring at the table. Jessica saw his jaw clench, his fingers tighten on the stem of his glass. She knew the sign. He was angry but holding it in. He always did that when he didn't want to argue in public. "I think I need some air," he said, standing up. Of course, Jessica leaned back in her chair. "Go on, run. It's what you do best." Brian paused and gave her a long look, a look full of pain, then walked toward the exit. Jessica watched him go, her heart hammering in her throat. And then she saw Christina, finished with her photos, slip away from the other guests and head for the same exit. "Oh, no you don't." Jessica stood, but was stopped by her chatty neighbor. "Dear, is everything all right? Did you and your husband have a fight?" "Everything's fine," Jessica forced a smile. "Just a little tired." She sidestepped the woman and headed for the exit. Her heart was racing, her palms were sweating. What were they doing out there? What were they talking about? Jessica knew eavesdropping was low, undignified, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know the truth, no matter how bitter. The exit from the main hall led to a small corridor with panoramic windows. Beyond the glass, the night city stretched out a scattering of lights, silhouettes of buildings, the distant glow of neon signs. By the window stood Brian and Christina. She was saying something, her head tilted, and he was listening, staring off into the distance. Then Christina took a step closer, placed a hand on his arm, and Jessica saw Brian freeze, but he didn't pull away. Everything inside her shattered. Jessica stood just a few feet away, hidden in the corridor's dim light, watching her marriage crumble, watching this woman touch her husband, and him allowing it. Watching them stand too close together, with an intimacy reserved for lovers or those about to become lovers. "Bri," Christina's voice was soft, enveloping. "I can see how hard this is for you. You know, you don't have to tolerate something that makes you unhappy." "Jessica doesn't make me unhappy," Brian objected, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Maybe not her," Christina conceded. "But your marriage does. The routine, the obligations. You see it yourself, the spark between you has been gone for a long time." Jessica clenched her fists, wanting to step out, to scream, to tear this scene apart, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Jessica spun around and walked briskly back into the restaurant. She would not stand in the shadows and watch her life fall apart. She would not give Christina that power. She walked past the dancing guests, grabbed her purse from the table, and headed for the coat check. Her hands trembled as she put on her light coat, but she forced herself to move slowly, with dignity. "Jessica, you're leaving already?" Christina appeared out of nowhere, her lips painted and curved into a look of false sympathy. "It's so early." "It's late," Jessica corrected her, buttoning her coat. "It's late enough for many things." Brian appeared behind her, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. "Jess, where are you going?" "I told you, I'm driving." "Then stay." Jessica turned to him, and there was so much coldness in her gaze that he flinched. "Christina offered you a place to stay. Take her up on her hospitality." "What?" Brian frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I'm tired of being the third wheel in my own marriage." Jessica took out her phone to call a car service. "Tired of pretending I don't see the way you look at her, the way she touches your arm and you don't pull away." "Jessica, for God's sake," Brian grabbed her arm. "We were just talking." "Talking," Jessica repeated, shaking her arm free. "You know, Brian, there are different kinds of cheating. It's not just physical. There's emotional cheating too. When you share things with another woman that you should be sharing with your wife, when you seek understanding, warmth, and support from her, you've already cheated on me. You just haven't gotten around to sleeping with her yet." Christina stood off to the side, observing the scene with poorly concealed satisfaction. A faint smile played on her lips. She was winning, and she knew it. "Jessica, there's no need for drama," she interjected softly. "We're all adults. Sometimes feelings just happen." "Feelings don't just happen," Jessica turned on her, fire blazing in her eyes. "They are cultivated. You have been methodically, step by step, destroying my marriage. The calls, the meetings, the helplessness you hid behind." And he fell for it, because men love to feel like heroes. "And what did you offer him?" Christina tilted her head, her tone hardening. "Nagging about forgotten milk? Complaints about being late? You turned him into a function, a provider, a father, a husband, but you forgot that he's also just a man who needs attention." Jessica felt something twist inside her because there was a bitter, unpleasant truth to Christina's words. When was the last time she had asked about something other than the mortgage or parent-teacher conferences? When had she asked not about his work, but about his dreams? "Jessica, let's just go home," Brian said, taking her by the elbow. "We'll talk calmly." "No." She pulled away. "I'm going alone." "You need to decide, Brian. Who are you with? Your family, or this memory of your youth?" The phone in her hand vibrated. The car would be there in 2 minutes. Jessica walked out of the restaurant without looking back. The May air was warm, smelling of blooming chestnut trees and distant rain. The city lived its nightlife. Drunken groups laughed somewhere, cars drove by, traffic lights blinked, and Jessica stood on the sidewalk, feeling something inside her collapse. The taxi, a white sedan with a worn interior, arrived quickly. The middle-aged driver gave a sleepy nod in greeting. Jessica gave him her address and leaned back in the seat, closing her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she saw the image of Christina and Brian by the window, standing too close. "Tough night?" the driver asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "You could say that." Jessica opened her eyes, watching the blurred lights pass by. "A woman in a red dress, alone at night," the driver said philosophically. "That's either a very good end to an evening or a very bad one." "The second one." Jessica tried to smile, but it came out crooked. They drove through the city center, past illuminated shop windows, past bars from which music spilled out, past 24-hour diners where night owls sat with their own nocturnal problems. Jessica looked at this city where she had lived for 14 years of her marriage, and it felt as if she were seeing it for the first time, or saying goodbye to it. It was hard to tell. Her phone rang. Brian. Jessica looked at the name on the screen and rejected the call. A minute later, a text message. "Jess, please, let's talk. I'm right behind you." "Don't," she typed back. "I need time to think." The house greeted her with darkness, save for the dim glow of a nightlight in the hall. Jessica took off her shoes, which had been torturing her feet all endless evening, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. Her mother-in-law was asleep on the living room sofa, covered with a blanket. A half-empty cup of tea sat on the coffee table. Jessica didn't wake her, explaining anything right now was beyond her strength. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water from the filter and sat at the table. Here, in this apartment, she had spent the best years of her life. On this very chair, 3-year-old Max had sat, smearing chocolate all over his face. By this window, tiny Katie had stood, demanding to be shown the moon. At this table, she and Brian had planned renovations, argued about wallpaper colors, and laughed at silly things. When had it all changed? Jessica tried to pinpoint the exact moment, but it eluded her. The changes had been slow, like rust eating away at metal from the inside. First, he started staying late at work. Then he spoke less at dinner. Then he stopped asking about her day, her thoughts, her feelings. They had turned into roommates, partners in parenting, but they had ceased to be lovers, friends, partners. And then Christina appeared, with her big eyes, her feigned helplessness, and her memories of their shared past. Jessica could blame her, but honesty demanded she admit that if there hadn't been cracks in their marriage, Christina wouldn't have been able to seep in. The front door clicked open. Brian. Jessica heard him talking to his mother in a hushed voice, heard Helen ask something in surprise, heard his short, irritated replies. Then his footsteps headed toward the kitchen. Brian stood in the doorway, disheveled, tired, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned. They looked at each other from across the kitchen, and in that gaze was everything. Years together, 2 children, a shared life, and the chasm that had suddenly opened between them. "Mom asked what happened," Brian said. "I told her we had a fight." "We didn't have a fight." Jessica slowly set her glass on the table. "You fight over small things. We're standing on the edge." "The edge of what?" "Divorce," Jessica said simply. And the word hung between them, heavy and final. Brian turned pale, gripping the doorframe. "Divorce?" he repeated, as if he hadn't understood. "Jess, are you serious? And how do you think this all ends?" She stood and paced the kitchen, feeling the pent-up tension demand release. "You're in love with another woman. Maybe you haven't admitted it to yourself yet, but I see it." "I'm not blind, Brian. I'm not in love. He stepped into the kitchen, closing the door behind him so as not to wake his mother. God, Jess, there's nothing between me and Christina. Not yet, Jessica clarified, but you want there to be. I saw how you looked at her, how you came alive next to her, as if you were young and free again. Brian sank onto a chair, running his hands over his face. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I am looking for something. I don't know what. A feeling that life isn't over, that there's still something ahead besides work and bills. That honesty was worse than any lie. Jessica felt something inside her snap. Then go to her, she said, surprised at how calm her voice sounded. If you're so miserable with me, if I'm just an obligation, then go. Free yourself. Jess, no. Really. She came closer, sitting across from him. I won't hold you here by force. I won't manipulate you with the kids or our past. If you want to leave, then leave. Brian looked at her, and there was such turmoil in his eyes that Jessica almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I don't want to leave, he said finally. I'm just tired of everything, and with Christina, it's easier to breathe. Because she's your escape from reality. Jessica leaned back in her chair. With her, you're not a dad, not a husband, not the guy who has to remember to pay the internet bill. You're just Bree, the fun-loving kid who used to climb into abandoned houses. But that's an illusion, Brian. If you two were together, reality would come crashing back. The bills, the chores, the problems. And you'd find out the magic wasn't in her, but in the absence of responsibility. Silence hung in the air. From the living room came the sound of her mother-in-law's soft snoring. From the kids' room, Katie's gentle breathing. The ordinary sounds of their home, their life. I don't know what to do, Brian confessed. Then I'll tell you. Jessica stood and went to the window. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was beginning to lighten. Tomorrow morning, you're going to pack a bag and leave for a few days. Go to your mother's, a friend's, wherever you want. You're going to think about what you really want. And I'm going to think about whether I'm prepared to live with a man who looks at me like an anchor. Jess, the kids. We'll tell the kids you're on a business trip, she cut him off. We won't traumatize them before we have to. But if you decide you want to be with Christina, you'll have to tell them the truth. Brian stood up, about to approach and hug her, but Jessica pulled back. Don't, she said. Right now, your touch just makes it hurt more. He left the kitchen, and a moment later, Jessica heard the bedroom door close. She remained by the window, looking out at the waking city, thinking about how life had a way of throwing surprises at you. Yesterday morning, she had been certain of her marriage. Tonight, she was on the verge of divorce. Morning came too quickly. Jessica hadn't slept, lying on the sofa in the living room under the same blanket her mother-in-law had used, listening to the house wake up. Helen was the first to rise, heading to the kitchen to put on the kettle. Jessica closed her eyes, feigning sleep. Explanations were unbearable right now. Then the children woke up. Max emerged, sleepy in his pajama pants and an old t-shirt, scratching his stomach. Katie ran out after him, already wide awake, her pigtails messy. Mommy? She saw Jessica on the sofa. Why are you sleeping here? We got back late. I didn't want to wake Daddy. Jessica sat up, fixing her hair. Good morning, sunshine. Katie, smelling of sleep and baby shampoo, climbed into her lap. Max silently flopped into an armchair, his face buried in his phone. 11-year-old boys don't hug their mothers in the morning anymore. Jessica knew this, but it still gave her a small pang of loss every time. How was the party? Helen asked, appearing from the kitchen with a cup of tea. Good, Jessica lied. It was fun. Her mother-in-law gave her a long, appraising look. She didn't believe her, but didn't press the issue in front of the children. Brian was the last to emerge from the bedroom. He was dressed and groomed, but looked as if he hadn't slept all night. Dark circles lay under his eyes, and his movements were slow and tired. Morning, he said to the kids, ruffling Max's hair and kissing Katie's head. He didn't even look at Jessica. Dad, can we go to the park today? Katie asked. You promised to go rollerblading. Not today, Princess. Brian poured himself some coffee. Dad has things to do. Always things to do, Max grumbled without looking up from his phone. You always have things to do. Jessica caught her mother-in-law's eye and knew the woman sensed everything. Helen was perceptive. Years of life had taught her to read people like an open book. After breakfast, once the kids had scattered to their rooms, Brian packed a small bag. Jessica stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching in silence. "I'll get a hotel for a few days," he said, zipping the bag. "To think." "Okay," she nodded. "Jess, he hesitated, searching for words. "I didn't want it to turn out like this." "I know." She gave a bitter smile. "Nobody ever does." "But it does." He left, and Jessica closed the door behind him. She leaned her back against it, closing her eyes. It had begun. The life she had known for 14 years was starting to fall apart. "Jessica." Helen came over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "What happened?" And Jessica broke. She cried for the first time through this nightmarish evening and night, finally allowing herself to be weak. Her mother-in-law hugged her, and they stood there in the hallway, two women trying to glue back together what one man had broken. An hour later, Jessica was sitting in a coffee shop across from her friend Marina. They needed to talk, and at home, under the watchful eye of her mother-in-law and the questioning gazes of her children, it was impossible. Marina listened, sipping her cappuccino, her expression growing darker and darker. "That bitch," she summarized when Jessica finished. "A classic homewrecker. I've seen her type before." "It's not just her." Jessica stirred sugar into her tea, though she usually drank it plain. "It's about me and Brian. We lost each other somewhere between parent-teacher conferences and grocery runs. So find each other again." Marina leaned across the table. 14 years of marriage isn't nothing. It's a huge part of your life. Are you really just going to throw it all away? "I'm not throwing it away," Jessica countered. "He's the one who's doubting, not me." Marina leaned back, studying her friend with a sharp gaze. They had been friends since college, had gone through first loves, heartbreaks, and weddings together. Jessica's and her own, which had ended in divorce 3 years ago. If anyone could understand what was happening, it was Marina. "Listen," she said, pouring herself some water. "Maybe you need a shake-up too. For the last few years, you've been nothing but mom and wife." "Where's Jessica?" The girl who used to dance till dawn, read poetry on the dorm roof, dream of opening her own design studio? Jessica winced. She grew up, became an adult, took on responsibilities, or she just died somewhere along the way, Marina said bluntly. "Jess, when was the last time you did something for yourself? Not for the kids, not for your husband, not for the family. For you." Jessica opened her mouth to answer, but realized she couldn't. It was true. Her life ran on a schedule: drop the kids at school, pick them up from activities, make dinner, check homework, do laundry, iron, go to the store. In between, she worked remotely as a designer for a small agency, doing logos and brochures. Not the studio she dreamed of, but something. "I don't remember," she admitted quietly. "See?" Marina nodded triumphantly. "And then you wonder why your husband is looking at someone else. Jess, you've become invisible to him, and to yourself. You've turned into a function." The words hit their mark, and everyone was painful. Jessica wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she couldn't, because Marina was right. Somewhere between her first and second maternity leave, between kids' parties and endless cooking, she had lost herself. She had stopped wearing bright lipstick, stopped wearing heels just because, stopped laughing at silly things. "What am I supposed to do now?" Jessica asked, feeling tears well up. "Run to the gym, get a new haircut, and hope he comes back?" "No," Marina shook her head. "Do it for yourself. Remember who you are without the roles of wife and mother. As for Brian, let him think. But don't you just sit around waiting. Show him what he's lost." They sat in the cafe for another hour, and gradually, Jessica felt a healthy, productive anger return, an anger that gave her the energy to act, not just sit at home and cry into her pillow. Marina was right. She needed to shake things up, to remind herself and the world that she was still alive, still capable of being interesting, desirable. They parted ways at the cafe entrance. Marina was heading to work, and Jessica decided to walk. The city on a Saturday morning was full of people, couples strolling hand in hand, families with children, lone joggers in tracksuits. Everyone seemed happy, content with their lives. Only Jessica walked down the sidewalk feeling as if her world had cracked in two. Her phone vibrated in her purse. Jessica pulled it out, expecting a message from Brian, but an unknown number was on the screen. "Jessica, it's Christina. We need to talk." Jessica stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, a passerby nearly colliding with her and muttering something under his breath. Christina. The nerve of this woman was unbelievable. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should she reply, or just block the number and forget about it? The Heather Cafe on Rose Street. In an hour, a second message came through. Jessica stood there, staring at the screen, feeling two desires at war within her. The first was to tell this woman to get lost, to show her she wouldn't play her games. The second was to meet her, to look her in the eye and say everything that had been building up, without witnesses, without Brian between them. "I'll be there," she typed, and immediately regretted it. But what's sent is sent. She spent the next hour at home, changing into jeans and a simple white blouse. No war paint, no provocative outfits. She was going not to seduce, but to settle things. The kids were in the kitchen with Helen. Jessica called out that she was running an errand and hurried out before any questions could be asked. The Heather Cafe was a small, cozy place with wooden tables and the smell of fresh pastries. Christina was already sitting in a corner by the window, wearing dark sunglasses, even though the sun was barely breaking through the clouds. When she saw Jessica, she took off the glasses, revealing red, swollen eyes. Had Christina been crying? It seemed so. It was so unexpected that Jessica was thrown off for a second. "Thanks for coming," Christina said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Jessica admitted honestly, sitting down. But curiosity won. "What did you want to say?" Christina was silent for a moment, fiddling with a napkin. A waitress came, took their order, 2 black coffees, and left. The cafe was nearly empty, save for an elderly couple talking quietly at the far wall. "I wanted to apologize," Christina said finally, her voice trembling. "Apologize?" Jessica couldn't hide her sarcasm. "For what, exactly? For hunting my husband for the past 6 months? For the spectacle you put on at your birthday party yesterday? For everything." Christina looked up, and there was such pain in her eyes that Jessica involuntarily softened. I behaved horribly, I know. But when I saw Bree again, when I saw him just as I remembered him, kind, attentive, strong, I couldn't help myself. My own marriage had fallen apart. I was alone and miserable, and he was like a lifeline. "He's married," Jessica reminded her harshly. "He has a family, 2 kids." "I know," Christina nodded. "And I know how that sounds. Selfish, cruel, disgusting. But feelings don't ask for permission. They just exist." The waitress brought their coffee, and they fell silent as she set down the cups. Jessica picked hers up and took a sip, hot, strong, scalding her tongue. She needed that pain to stay focused, to not let herself be swayed by pity. "So what now?" she asked. "Did you come here to ask for forgiveness or to announce that you're taking my husband?" "I came to tell you that I'm backing off." Christina looked her straight in the eye. "After you left yesterday, I did a lot of thinking about what I was doing, about the person I've become, and I realized I don't want to be the woman who destroys someone else's family. That's not who I am. Or at least, not who I want to be." Jessica felt something inside her shift. She had expected anything new. Attacks, manipulations, tears, but not this. Not surrender. "Are you serious?" she asked, disbelieving. "Completely." Christina took out her phone and showed Jessica the screen. It was a text message to Brian. "Bree, I'm so sorry about last night. I think it's best if we don't see each other anymore. I'm moving out of the city. I found a job somewhere else. Be happy. Sent it half an hour ago." Jessica stared at the screen, rereading the words, unable to believe it. It was that simple. Christina was backing down. The problem was solved. Her marriage was saved. "Why?" she asked. "Why the change of heart?" "Because yesterday, when you were leaving, I saw the way Brian looked at you," Christina said, putting her phone away. "And I realized he loves you. Maybe not as passionately as he used to. Maybe he's tired, confused, looking for something new. But he loves you. And me? I was just nostalgia for him, an escape from reality. If we had gotten together, Sooner or later, he would have come back to you anyway. In his thoughts, in his comparisons, in his regrets, and I don't want to be eternally second best." The words sounded sincere, and Jessica suddenly understood that Christina was genuinely suffering. She wasn't putting on a show, wasn't manipulating her. She was just telling the bitter, honest truth. "I don't know what to say," Jessica confessed. "You don't have to say anything." Christina stood up, leaving money on the table. "I just wanted you to know, Brian is free. Fight for him if you want to, or let him go. But that's between you two now. I'm out of the picture." She walked out of the cafe, leaving Jessica sitting with her cooling coffee and a whirlwind of thoughts in her head. Jessica sat in the quiet cafe, staring out the window at the passers-by, trying to process what had just happened. Christina had retreated. Just like that, without a fight, without drama, without any attempt to hold on to Brian. It should have been a relief, a cause for celebration. But instead, a strange emptiness grew inside her, mixed with confusion, because now there was no one left to blame. Christina had exited the stage, but the problems in her marriage remained. And if Brian came back and she had a feeling he would, what then? Would they just go on as before, pretending nothing had happened, until a new Christina appeared a few years down the line? Or until he left for good? Jessica took out her phone and texted Brian. "I need to see you. Tonight. At the park by the lake where we first met. 7 p.m. The reply came almost instantly. "I'll be there." She returned home around lunchtime. Helen was making soup. The kids were in the living room, watching a cartoon. A normal, peaceful Saturday scene. But inside Jessica, everything was in turmoil. "Max? Katie? Lunch!" Helen called, ladling soup into bowls. The kids reluctantly tore themselves away from the screen and took their seats at the table. Katie immediately started chattering about the cartoon, about princesses and magical castles. Max was silent, his head bent over his bowl, the sullen silence of an 11-year-old that parents attribute to puberty. "Mom, when is Dad coming back?" he asked suddenly, without looking up. Jessica froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Soon, sweetie. He has work to do." "You're lying." Max looked up, and in his eyes was such adult sorrow that Jessica felt a stab of guilt. "You had a fight. I heard you crying last night." Helen paused, her hand holding a slice of bread, looking at her grandson in surprise. Katie stopped talking, her gaze shifting from her brother to her mother. "Max," Jessica began cautiously, "sometimes adults argue. It's normal." "It's not normal for Dad to leave," the boy said, pushing his bowl away. "Leo's parents fought like that, and then they got divorced. Are you getting a divorce too?" "No!" Katie jumped up from her chair, her eyes filling with tears. "Mommy, say no!" Jessica stood and hugged her daughter, feeling the small body tremble with sobs. Across the table, Max watched, not crying, but with the same fear in his eyes. And next to him sat her mother-in-law, her face stern and unreadable. "I don't know," Jessica said honestly, stroking Katie's hair. "I really don't know what's going to happen, but I know for sure that Dad and I love you both very, very much. And whatever happens, that will never change." "But you love each other, right?" Katie sobbed. That was the question Jessica couldn't answer with certainty. Did she love Brian? Yes, probably. Out of habit, history, a shared past. But the passionate, all-consuming love from the beginning? No, that love had died somewhere between the first maternity leave and the mortgage. "Of course we do," she lied. "We're just a little tired. It happens with adults." Max snorted in disbelief but didn't argue. Lunch ended in a tense silence, broken only by Katie's slurping and the clinking of spoons. Afterward, the kids ran off to their rooms, and Helen cornered Jessica in the kitchen. "What's really going on?" she asked, loading the dishwasher. Jessica sat down, wearily rubbing her temples. "Brian is confused. He met an old friend, got his head turned. He thinks he'd be happier with her. Christina made a scene yesterday, and today she gave up the fight for him." "Fool," her mother-in-law summarized curtly. "Men often go foolish in their 40s. It's called a midlife crisis. They think they can get their youth back by finding a younger mistress." "She's 38, Jessica corrected automatically. "Still a fool," Helen repeated. "But you're no better." Jessica looked up in surprise. Me? You let yourself become a mouse, her mother-in-law said, her tone harsh but not unkind. You stopped taking care of yourself, stopped being interesting. It was always just the kids and the house. A man needs a woman, not a maid, who also happens to be the mother of his children. The words were hurtful but fair. Jessica wanted to object, to defend herself, but she couldn't. What should I do? She asked quietly. Remember who you are. Helen closed the dishwasher and straightened up. And if you decide to fight for your husband, then fight for real. If you decide to let him go, then let him go with your head held high. But don't sit around playing the victim. It's pathetic. Evening came quickly, as if time itself were rushing Jessica toward the final act. She changed into a simple gray dress, threw on a light jacket, and left the house, telling the kids she was going to the store. Lying to them was getting harder and harder. The park greeted her with the coolness of evening and the smell of freshly cut grass. The lake shimmered in the rays of the setting sun. Couples strolled along the paths, and children ran around with ice cream. Jessica walked to the familiar bench, the very one where, 15 years ago, Brian had kissed her for the first time. He was already there, sitting and looking at the water. He only turned his head when she sat down beside him. Hey, he said quietly. Hey. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rustle of leaves, the lapping of water against the shore, the distant laughter of a child. Christina texted me, Brian began. Said she's leaving town. I know. Jessica nodded. We saw each other today. You did? He looked at her, surprised. Why? She wanted to apologize and explain why she was backing off. Brian rubbed his face with his hands, the way he always did when he was confused. I don't know how I feel, he admitted. I feel like I should be relieved that the problem is solved, but instead I just feel empty. Because she was your escape from reality, Jessica said. And now the escape is over, and you're left alone with the thing you were running from. She corrected herself. With us. With yourself. With the fact that you're unhappy with your life, that you feel trapped. Brian, I don't want to be your trap. He looked at her, and there was so much pain in his eyes that she almost regretted her words. You're not a trap, he said. Jess, I honestly don't know what's wrong with me. I love you. I love the kids, but I feel like I'm suffocating in this life. Then maybe we need to let each other go, Jessica said, and her heart began to race. Give you the freedom you want so badly. Brian was silent for a long time, staring at the lake. The sun had almost set, and the water had turned dark and opaque. I don't know if I want freedom, he said at last. Or if I'm just afraid I'm missing out on something important, that life is passing me by while I'm stuck in a routine. Life isn't passing you by. Jessica took his hand. Life is the routine. Making breakfast, taking the kids to school, kissing them goodnight. All of that is life, Brian. It's not adventures and passion. It's the simple, ordinary days. And if you can't find happiness in that, then the problem isn't me, and it isn't Christina. The problem is you. Brian squeezed her hand in response, and Jessica felt his fingers tremble. They sat on the bench, enveloped by the deepening twilight, and for the first time in years, they talked not about the children, or the bills, or household chores, but about themselves. About what had really been happening between them all this time. When I met Christina, Brian began, speaking slowly, choosing his words, I suddenly felt like I was 20 again. Remember what I was like back then? Full of plans. I dreamed of starting my own business, of traveling, of writing, and now what? I'm a manager at someone else's company. A mortgage for the next 20 years. The only traveling I do is a trip to the beach once a year. Do you regret marrying me? Jessica asked directly. Having our kids? No. He shook his head. God, no. It's just that somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I stopped being Brian and became just dad, husband, provider. Sometimes I look in the mirror and I don't recognize the person looking back. Jessica understood. She understood that feeling better than he could possibly imagine, because she had gone through the same thing herself. When Max was born, and then Katie, she had dissolved into motherhood like sugar in hot tea. She stopped being Jessica and became just Mom. And only now, on the brink of her marriage collapsing, was she beginning to remember who she used to be. "You know what the scary part is?" she said, looking at the dark surface of the lake. "I got lost too. I don't know who I am without the roles of wife and mother, and I'm scared, too, that life is passing me by. But the difference between us is that I didn't go looking for salvation in someone else's arms." "That's not fair." Brian turned to her. "I didn't sleep with Christina. I didn't even kiss her." "But you wanted to?" Jessica looked him in the eye. "You wanted to, Brian. And in some ways, that's worse, because a physical affair can be a moment of weakness. An emotional one is a conscious choice. You chose to share things with her that you should have been sharing with me." Brian let go of her hand, stood up, and walked along the shore. The lampposts along the path lit up one by one, wrapping the park in a soft yellow glow. In the distance, a street musician played a sad melody on a guitar, one that perfectly matched the moment. "What do we do?" he asked, stopping and looking at Jessica. "I don't want to lose my family. I don't want my kids to grow up without a father. But I also don't want to pretend everything is okay when it's not." "Then, let's stop pretending." Jessica stood and walked over to him. "Let's admit that our marriage is sick, that we're both unhappy in our own ways, and let's try to start over." "How?" Hope flickered in his voice, fragile and uncertain. "Honestly." Jessica took his hands, looking into his eyes. "You tell me about your fears, your dreams, what you feel is missing, and I'll tell you mine. And we'll try to find a way to be not just parents, but people, separate people with our own interests and desires. And then, maybe, we can find each other again. And if we don't, then we'll separate," Jessica said simply. "But at least we'll do it honestly, not with cheating and lies, but like adults, for ourselves and for the kids." Brian was silent, processing her words. Jessica could see his mind at work, weighing, analyzing. He had always been so methodical, so cautious, so afraid of making the wrong move. "Okay," he said at last. "Let's try, but I can't promise it will work." "I can't either," Jessica agreed. "But we have to try, at least for Max and Katie." They hugged, awkwardly, stiffly, like strangers, not like people who had lived together for 14 years. But in that embrace, there was a new kind of honesty, a release from the need to pretend. They went home together. Brian brought his bag in from the car and walked into the apartment. The children ran out to greet him with shouts of joy. Katie clung to his neck. Max gave a reserved nod, but relief washed over his eyes. Helen peeked out from the kitchen, gave them an assessing look, and seemed satisfied with what she saw. "Is Daddy staying?" Katie whispered, not letting go of her father. "He's staying," Jessica confirmed. "We're all staying together." The evening passed with ordinary domestic routines: dinner, watching a movie as a family, putting the kids to bed. Jessica sat on the edge of Katie's bed, stroking her daughter's hair as she drifted off to sleep, thinking about the long, difficult road ahead. She and Brian hadn't gotten each other back. They had only agreed to try to find each other again. And that was scarier than just continuing to live on autopilot. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and Helen had gone home, Jessica and Brian sat in the kitchen with tea. A notebook lay on the table between them, Jessica's idea. To write down everything: desires, fears, dreams, resentments. A clean slate was impossible, but they could try to clear away the rubble of the past. "I want to get back into music," Brian said unexpectedly. "Remember I used to play the guitar? Wrote songs?" "I remember." Jessica smiled. "You dedicated one to me. It was horribly clumsy but very sweet." "The guitar is still on the back porch," he chuckled. "Covered in dust. I thought about throwing it out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it." "Don't throw it out." Jessica covered his hand with hers. "Get it out. Play it. And I want to get back to painting. I used to paint, remember?" "You were talented," Brian nodded. "Why did you stop?" "No time," Jessica shrugged. "The kids, the house, work, it all ate up my time. But I want to take it back. At least an hour a day for myself." They talked late into the night, writing down their desires, big and small, in the notebook. Brian wanted to learn how to cook, to go hiking, to finally read War and Peace, which he'd been putting off for 20 years. Jessica dreamed of taking dance classes, of a trip to the ocean without the kids, of having her own watercolor exhibition someday in the future. And gradually, word by word, they began to get to know each other all over again. It turned out that hidden behind those 14 years of marriage were two strangers, each with their own dreams they were afraid to voice aloud. "Do you think we can do it?" Jessica asked when the clock showed 1:30 in the morning. "I don't know," Brian answered honestly, "but I want to try. Really try. Not for the kids, not because it's what we're supposed to do. For us." Jessica nodded, feeling something fragile and timid bloom inside her. Hope. Maybe